Air Commodore Beach, it's a pleasure to have you at the conference. Could I ask you just to perhaps recap on your presentation from this morning for those of us who are unlucky to not be a part of it?
Sure. I think my presentation was in two parts really. The first part reflected my personal experience in command of the Royal Air Force in Afghanistan and talked about the lessons that we should learn from that campaign, but also to reflect, of course, that Afghanistan is now, for most of us, in the rearview mirror and needs us now to look to the future at what combat air will be required to do. So my presentation was as much about looking at that transition to contingency and to make the point, of course, that for combat air and for the Royal Air Force, it's been a return to contingency that's been going on for some time, are reflected on our operations in Baltic air policing, our tactical reconnaissance in Africa, and our activity on Cyprus, amongst others, to say that we are really busy, we continue to be busy, and the nature of the threat continues to evolve and therefore requires us to evolve too. So it was a reflection on the utility of combat air beyond Afghanistan. And my second part of the presentation was really to look at the capabilities we have, whether it be Tornado and all that it does, Typhoon and of course F-35 in the future, and look at how we're introducing those capabilities and what that means for us. And I tried to emphasise the fact that although we're returning to contingency, it's not a return to the status quo ante, rather it's to embrace new capabilities and new technologies in the way we train. And central to that is the use of synthetics, and I try to make the point that for Typhoon it's a really exciting journey. We've linked our synthetic devices at Lossiemouth and Coningsby, so we're now able to participate in shared training between the two main operating bases, and for us that journey of synthetics is really important. It will underpin the generation of capability for us into the next generation and is really an exciting time.
As you've said, the discussion within this community about transitioning to the post-Afghanistan world has been going on for some time. What can you tell us perhaps about the practical progress that we're seeing in trying to meet the time frames that have been laid out and ultimately achieve the ambition that has been set over the past few years?
I think for combat air it's a slightly different question. If you look at large parts of defence, and indeed for some elements of combat air, there's been very much a focus on Afghanistan for very good reason as defence's main effort. And you've seen Army rotating through Afghanistan for the best part of a decade, and the Tornado Force, and before it the Harrier Force, very much focused on the air-land integration aspects of Afghanistan, with the result that some elements of our training have necessarily taken a back seat, and here we think about things like air-maritime integration and some of those broader skills. But I would make the point that although we have focused principally on defence's main effort, as I said earlier, the number of missions that combat air has been asked to do at the same time has been hugely varied. Baltic air policing with our Typhoons in Lithuania, the rapid deployment of Typhoons to Cyprus to defend against potential Syrian aggression, the use of Tornado with its reconnaissance capability in Africa recently. All of these illustrate the fact that combat air is transitioning in contact and will continue to do so. So although we are transitioning to Future Force 2020, it's an evolution that for combat air has been going on for some time.
Excellent. We also we're hearing from a spectrum of different speakers from a multinational environment. How important is the idea of integration and partnerships between those forces from your perspective, and what could you perhaps tell us about methods of training or bringing these countries in together to be a more cohesive unit for the future operation?
I mean, it won't surprise you to know that I'm a huge fan and a huge believer in coalition training as well as operations. And if you look at the NATO context, we've been operating very closely together for decades, and I am a product of that. My 30 years service has always been in a coalition context, whether it be NATO or a coalition in another sense. So the importance of interoperability underpins everything that combat air does. I think that's as true tomorrow as it ever was yesterday. And if we look at what's happening right now in the skies over Iraq, you can see a broad spectrum of participants that are able to operate together really well because they've had the benefit of training. Clearly that training has had a NATO focus in the past, but it is becoming more and more international, and one of my squadrons, number 11 squadron, has just returned from an air tactical leadership course in the United Arab Emirates, where that is again a multinational training exercise with some of our emerging partners in the Middle East. So that is a really important aspect of our training. One of the issues for us is how we manage to train with our international colleagues when we lean more into the synthetic environment. So as I said, Typhoon will increase the use of synthetics in the future, and one of the key challenges for us is to make sure that we can train with our coalition friends and partners, not just across the Atlantic, but also more broadly in Europe and in the Middle East, to make sure that we can train synthetically as we would wish to operate live.
So there is a need to perhaps enhance what is taking place to transition to this new environment, a need to maintain the levels of interoperability that are already ongoing. But being, of course, that budgets are as they are, is the service looking at innovative ways to get around perhaps some of the unconventional problems that it's facing currently and tomorrow?
I think for air forces that aspire to be expeditionary in nature, you would need to continue to deploy to exercise together. The exercising of the aircraft will improve your tactical ability and your ability to operate in contested environments, but there is a skill in and of itself to deploy lock, stock and barrel with your aircraft engineers and all the associated equipment over extended distances. And we saw that most recently when we deployed one of my squadrons to Malaysia and operated there with the Malaysian Air Force as part of the Five Powers Defence Agreement. That was really important, not just because of the tactical activity, but because it's really important to practice deploying over range. So although there are pressures associated with maintaining an air exercise programme across the globe, it is pretty fundamental to the way we do business if we wish to maintain our expeditionary capabilities. I think my key focus now is understanding how we weave the synthetic training into this and make sure that we have the ability to train as we do in Malaysia, for example, or in the UAE or indeed the US, how we bring together those participants synthetically. That to me is the bigger challenge.
And while we've been very lucky to hear from you, have you yourself heard from anyone in particular today, or heard any discussions that have been particularly notable for you and have perhaps helped you in your role to understand the pressures?
I think they've all been fascinating, to be honest, and a really, really good start to the two-day session. I was particularly struck by the talk from the Nigerian Air Force. No surprise really, but it's not an area that I have detailed knowledge of, and it was fascinating to hear how the Nigerian Air Force are applying some of the principles of air power to their unique circumstances, and there are lessons, many lessons I think we can take from that experience and import into our thinking. So that was really helpful, and I was quite struck by the most recent presentation by our academic colleague on the force mix, the UAV manned ratio, and the challenges facing small air forces. I think quite thought-provoking, provocative. There are elements I agree with, elements that I don't, but that's the important part of these meetings, is to hear, be challenged, to test your views, and to use the opportunity to chat to people in the margins of the conference to explore in more detail and understand their viewpoints. That's been really helpful. And of course to hear from industry, both in terms of the synthetic delivery and indeed in terms of the providers of capability, whether it be platforms or subsystems, on where they see the future is really helpful to shape my understanding.
Well, there's certainly a lot to talk about. I hope you continue to make the best of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.